All right, so back to classes, and now the end run for the course. We spent the last several weeks looking at the biology of dinosaurs, but the next couple lectures we're going to actually look at the biology of their contemporaries, sort of set the world, what the world was like during the Mesozoic beyond dinosaurs, so that starting on Friday we can bring that world to an end. So starting Friday we begin our look at the extinction, and then the last Friday and the final class day we're going to look at sort of the interactions of humans and dinosaurs, not simultaneous other than birds, but the role of dinosaurs in human culture and things of that nature. All right, so we think of the Mesozoic as the age of dinosaurs, but of course there were plenty of other organisms around at the time. And today we're going to focus on flying reptiles, the pterosaurs, and we're going to start our look at the marine reptiles. If we don't finish them today, they'll continue on to Wednesday, where we're going to look at another group of animals that arose during the Mesozoic, and that's us. Not humans, but mammals. And if we have time, I don't think we will, but if we have time, I may cover the origin of another group that arose during the Mesozoic, and that's flowers. So, when I talked about bird flight origins, I mentioned that gliding is actually pretty widespread and evolves convergently among many different groups of vertebrates. So we have flying fish and flying frogs and so forth, various gliding mammals. And there are plenty of gliding sauropsids. Remember, Sauropsida is the technical term for the clade of animals that includes birds, lizards and snakes, crocodilians, turtles, so reptiles in the cladistic sense. And we have some gliding sauropsids today, like Draco here, the gliding lizard, we have the gliding snakes. But throughout the Mesozoic, and even before, there were various other gliding sauropsids of various stripes. And as in the present world, it looks like the vast majority of them, if not the entirety of them, were arboreal creatures that were climbing trees and leaping off and taking advantage of that lift as they went up into trees to go from tree to tree or tree to ground. But, as we also saw when I talked about the origin of avian flight, there was one group other than the avian part of dinosaurs that evolved powered flight. They did it first, and that's these guys. That's the pterosaurs. So today we're actually going to look a little bit at pterosaur biology and pterosaur diversity before we move on to the marine reptiles. So yes, they're vermin. Do not feed. Now, okay, so Pterosauria. The name literally means winged reptiles. The pter at the beginning of that is related to the Pteryx in Archaeopteryx, and for that matter, to the pter in helicopter. Although the way we say helicopter, the P is no longer silent. So a helicopter is helicopter, spiral wing. You never thought about that before? That's what it means. Pterosauria, winged lizard, winged reptile. Pterosaurs first appear in the late Triassic, around the time, a little after, but their fossil record isn't as dense, so not a surprise. A little after the first dinosaurs. They are indeed archosaurs, and specifically the ornithodyryn archosaurs. And if we want to summarize their anatomy in one phrase, they've got a wing made from manual digit 4, or the wing finger is the ring finger. So they've lost the pinky. Digits 1, 2, and 3 still have some grasping function, at least in most of them. And the ring finger is stretched out an incredible distance to become the main support for the wing. We'll go into more detail of their anatomy, but that's a way to start out. So let's see, here's a very typical late pterosaur, well, it's very well-known late pterosaur, as projected, about life size, actually. So this is Pteranodon. Wings without teeth is actually what the name means, although people in pop culture just want to stick teeth in their jaws, even though they didn't have them. But just a reminder Pterosaurs are not birds. They are not birds. And they're totally not dinosaurs. They branched off prior to the ancestor of Iguanodon, Megalosaurus, and Diplodocus. This animal, on the other hand, is a dinosaur. 100% a dinosaur. It is not too evolved to be considered a dinosaur. That is an impossible statement. It is a dinosaur. Get over it. Many of us engaged in the consuming of large quantities of dinosaur meat in the last week. Oh, you may have as well, if that's the sort of thing you do. So, totally a dinosaur, not a dinosaur, but closely related. As I like to say, pterosaurs are dinosaurs' funny-looking cousins. They really are weirdly transformed, and this is our current understanding, as of the last couple of years, of the relationships. So we have over here is all of Archosauria. These are the crocodile line, the Pseudoseuchia, which remember were the dominant group in the Triassic. This is an obscure branch. I mentioned them in passing. The Aphanosaurs, they're closer to ornithodyrans than they are to Pseudoseuchians. And they have only a handful of traits that show that they're closer over here. In contrast, the primitive members of Ornithodyra, whether they're on the pterosaur branch or the dinosaur branch, are pretty similar to each other. But pterosaurs went off in their own rather weird direction. And in fact, it's these little early pterosauromorphs, which we only recognize were on the pterosaur line rather than the dinosaur line in the last couple of years, due to more complete specimens, that show us sort of the condition they evolved from. And there are numerous derived features. We're not going to talk about them in class, but this is the figure from that paper showing lots of these derived features that unite them. And so, given that these are typically small-bodied animals, and given that most flighted organisms, most volant organisms, or at least most gliding organisms, evolved from life in the trees, it seems not unreasonable that maybe these Lagurpitids, these proto-pterosaurs, may have been tree climbers, at least some of them, and that flight evolved from up in the trees. That said, we do not yet have stages like these represented in the fossil record. So unlike the history of birds, where, as you saw, we don't really have any big gaps there. We have sort of a continuity from typical fully terrestrial theropods through creatures that could get up into the trees and have sort of a broader wing structure, to early but poorly flying members of the bird lineage, to more derived birds, etc. We don't have that for pterosaurs. In part, maybe because they were mostly in these forests. Forests are typically not the best environment for preservation. You want lakes and streams and so forth. And pterosaurs have extremely hollow bones, even more hollow than birds. It doesn't make them that well preservable. But someday, hopefully, we'll begin to narrow down this transition. So speaking of which, so extremely hollow bones. So over here, we see how thin the bone of a pterosaur could be. That doesn't make them super fragile, though, in the sense that they weren't going to crumble if you just picked them up in your hand and crushed them. And they wouldn't be as resilient as a mammal of the same size, but there's a reason, for instance, bicycle tubes are tubes and not rods. That this, having a hollow tube, is actually structurally a quite sensible use, a quite mechanically advantageous use of limited material. Because these pterosaurs were trying to balance out two things. They wanted to be mechanically strong, because they're subjecting their bodies to some pretty intense forces when you're a flying animal. But they want to make it light, because the more heavy you are, the more difficult it is to achieve flight. And so they sort of balanced out towards trying to select for as advantageous a level as they could select for. So much like the hollow tubes in a bicycle are mechanically strong but lightweight, same thing for pterosaur bones. So here's a recent summary of some of the attributes of pterosaurs. We'll talk about them in a little more detail. So we've got We'll see that pterosaurs have a unique bone in the wrist. We'll talk about that in more detail. Like their cousins, the dinosaurs, they have a big delta pectoral crest. They're very different shaped in them, but it's evolved for the reason it gets quite large we saw in maniraptorans, or penoraptorans, rather. That's the ability to flap, pull your arms downward. Famously, of course, the wing finger is the ring finger, or the ring finger is the wing finger. As we talked about in the last lecture, and as I'll review here, pterosaurs seem to be fuzzy as well. Fuzzy the way basal dinosaurs seem to be, suggesting, in fact, the first ornithodyrans may have been fuzzy. And the wing is not simply skin. I'll talk more about that. It is reinforced by internal structures. All right, I thought I'd taken out the transitions. So here we go. This is the ancestral wing form for a pterosaur. So I said that the ring finger is the wing finger, but the wing is not just the forelimb. As I touched on when I talked about bird flight origins, pterosaurs and bats are different from birds, because remember, in birds, the wing is the front limb, and the hind limb is totally separate from it. The hind limb, in fact, retained running abilities in most bird lineages and their ancestors. In pterosaurs, like bats, the wing includes the forelimb and the hind limb. And in fact, there's a stretch of skin between the neck and the wrist, between the fingertip and the ankle, between one digit 5 and the other digit 5. It's actually going between the feet. The tail is above it. So the tail's not incorporated there. The tail's running above that surface, and then wrapping it around the other way. And there's this extra little bone in here I'll talk about in a moment when we get close up to it. So that's the basic wing structure, the ancestral wing structure. We will see there's a derived group of pterosaurs that modify this. So here is a look at the structure in Pteranodon. So within the wing, as I said, it's not merely skin stretched around the body the way it is in a bat. But there are muscle fibers running throughout it with these reinforced structures coming from the muscle fibers that they could flex and change the shape of the wing even independently of moving the arms or legs around. So even holding their arms and legs in the same position, they could pull inwards or relax the trailing edge of that wing. If you're an engineer or you're into aerospace engineering, you may have heard the phrase smart wings. These guys have that, or had that. You know, I think I may have forgotten to put a slide in about it. I'm just going to back up over here. I just want to mention in passing, in case I don't get it, because I mentioned this bone a couple times. One of the wrist bones, one of the carpals, has been modified to what's called a wing bone. Not very good. Pteroid, Pteroid. And that helps control the leading edge of the wing. It is functionally similar to the alula of birds. Remember, birds, the thumb, or derived birds, the thumb has feathers on it, and that's called the alula. And like that, pterosaurs would have used that to help control the wing more precisely. Now, to be fair, there are a couple people who now deny this, even though they published significant information supporting this. But the vast majority of pterosaur workers agree that when you look at well-preserved specimens, they're covered with fuzz. This fuzz has been given the name pycnofibers, heavy fibers. And it may or may not be homologous with the fuzz of dinosaurs. Now, of course, you need special circumstances for this stuff to be preserved. It's not going to preserve in a typical environment. You need the same types of environments that preserve mammalian fur or dinosaurian fuzz, or scales of very small animals and so forth. But there are environments that have that, and this shows some of that. So yes, these guys were little fuzzy guys. In fact, the first evidence of fuzz on pterosaurs was found a century or more than a century, before dinosaurian fuzz was. And there were arguments that pterosaurs were warm-blooded animals long before that was the serious argumentation about dinosaurs. So here's another one. We see the structures coming off of the back of the head. Now, some of the fibers people have identified may actually be not these fuzz, but some of those fibers of the wing that have become somewhat detached. But the vast majority of these do seem to be real fuzz. And whether or not they're branched represents a matter of debate, particularly because the best preserved specimens so far are not as well preserved as we'd like. We're really hoping to find one of these guys in amber one day, and that would really solve the situation. So if we've got fuzz down here, and we don't have any skin preserved for the intermediate forms. Oh, I forgot to update this. Euryapsids should be flipped over here. So they should be flipped around this way. And we do have it in Dinosauria, then perhaps fuzz is ancestral down here for all of ornithodyrans, as I talked about last lecture. So we saw in the last couple lectures the significance of respiration in terms of physiology. That if you're going to power an active metabolism, you need to flush fresh oxygen and nutrients to the cells and get rid of the waste products. So you can't just rely on the old-fashioned rib breathing that the vertebrates have ancestrally. Pterosaurs have a set of features that show them as sort of intermediate in some ways between, or not intermediate, hybrids of the Saurischian model that birds retain and the crocodile model. Like Saurischians, they have complex air sac system that invades their vertebrae. So we've long known that those were there. Like crocodilians, they have an extra structure coming anterior from the pelvis. For that matter, to a certain degree, like ornithischians, but this is more like the crocodilian situation in that it's mobile, it's not firmly attached. In the case of the crocodilians, remember, it was the pubis. The pubis itself was no longer attached to the rest of the pelvis. It could move back and forth and helped pump the liver back and forth. In the case of pterosaurs, it's not the pubis. The pubis is fused in with the rest of the vertebrae. It's a brand new bone called the prepubis, one on each side. And so it looks as if the pterosaurian model involved bird-like compression of the body to move the air sacs back and forth. But that compression is achieved through a crocodile-like prepubis pump. So instead of the liver pump driven by the mobile pubis in crocodilians, in this case it's driven by this brand new bone, the prepubis, with muscles coming off of that to attach to presumably the liver or other structures in front of it. And so here is looking at the compression of the body going on, the prepubis moving back and forth, etc. So we've seen, they have advanced respiration. As we saw at the lectures last week and before, we look at the growth rate, the bone apposition rate, and so forth. Pterosaurs had dinosaur-like bone tissue and dinosaur-like growth rate. They have furry insulation. All these point to them being fully endothermic. As I said before, people were accepting of pterosaurs as being endotherms long before they were more typically accepting of dinosaurs being endotherms. And since these guys are, and their sister taxon, dinosaurs are, it might well be that the common ancestor of both groups may have been endothermic. And as I talked about at the end of last time, that it may even be that moderate levels of endothermy are ancestral for Archosauria, and then what happened at Ornithodyra, it got kicked up a notch. So let's take a little look at the evolution of pterosaurs. So we've got a simplified phylogeny over here, and a modern human. In fact, they work on pterosaurs, and a series of pterosaurs of different body sizes to give you a sense of the range of sizes in these forms. And traditional pterosaur classification involves one paraphyletic assemblage of primitive forms, so not a clade, but a grade, and then an advanced clade called the pterodactyloids, the pterodactyls. So we'll start with the non-pterodactyloids first. So these Basal pterosaurs, the early branches are called rhamphorhynchoids after their most famous member, which is actually one of the most derived ones, one of the ones towards the transition to pterodactyloids. These guys show up in the late Triassic. They persist into the early Cretaceous. Most of them have a long tail, unlike their cousins. And where preserved, those tails typically end with some sort of vein or fin at the end. Sometimes shaped like a diamond, sometimes shaped like a Valentine heart. And that's almost certainly, in part, a steering organ, although it may have had display functions as well. These guys have relatively short metacarpals, so that's in contrast with their derived cousins. And these are the ones where the wing goes from ankle to ankle. They appear to have been not particularly good movers on the ground. Now, they did move on the ground occasionally. We do have some trackways from them, but nowhere near the number of trackways we have for their derived relatives. And so they may have spent more time clinging to the trees or cliffs or whatever than do their cousins. In that context, they'd be a lot more like most groups of bats. Most modern groups of bats are not particularly good at moving around on the ground, and so they're either flying or they're crawling up and down surfaces, but they're not spending a huge amount of time on the ground. To be fair, some of the rhamphorhynchoids do look like they did. They weren't entirely helpless on the ground, but they weren't really specialists at it. And here we've got a wide variety of forms. We've got short faces and long faces and snouty faces and so forth. Oh, by the way, an Euryapsida shown here with a little stumpy tail. We now know it had a long tail like its cousins. So here's a fish eater, Euryapsida, as an example. Now, in the last 15 years, we've actually found a really great example of the transitions from rhamphorhynchoid grade to pterosaur grade. And the joke is it was sort of like flying into evolution because it's been transformed from the front of the snout basically to the shoulders. It's like a pterodactyloid. But everything behind it is relatively primitive. So it's like there's a wall here or a force field of evolution, and it's in the midst of flying through it. This was the first one of these guys discovered. We now have a whole clade of this group at the point of transition. And so, here we have these going through from a primitive rhamphorhynchoid through this particular form, Darwinopterus, towards this next phase, where the tail's going to shorten up, and metacarpus, the hand, the long bones of the hand become longer, and the fifth toe reduces, which frees up the connection, or which removes the connection from ankle to ankle. So this next derived group is Pterodactyloidea, the pterodactyls, literally winged fingers. And their differences, again, they've got a more elongate left metacarpus, they have a short tail, and didn't highlight it down here, but they shortened up metacarpal 5, which was the thing that was connecting the wing membrane between the ankles. And pterodactyloids have been were hugely successful. They first appeared in the late Jurassic. They survived until the end of the Cretaceous. All the later pterosaurs were pterodactyloids. And the joke is that pterodactyloids are the dinosaurs which conquered the land. So about the conquest of the air. These guys, by having these longer metacarpals, and by disconnecting the wing between the legs, now can walk around on all fours a lot better than could their cousins. And their trackways become a lot more common, and they begin to adapt to lifestyles that might involve stalking around on the ground more often. Now, we have, as I said, trackways of these guys. So here's a restoration of what one might look like walking around. And here's some animations, including a smaller one, shown sort of galloping. So they look weird, but they seem to have been quite good at moving around on the ground. Now, pterodactyloids at least, and possibly their rhamphorhynchoid ancestors, seem to have launched into the air in a fashion different than most bats or birds. And most bats or birds, the hind limb generates a lot of the lift if they launch up. In pterosaurs, especially pterodactyloids, it looks like the forelimb pushes them off. So basically they push themselves off high enough to the ground, take a wing stroke, and then start flying from that. And as you can see, their forelimbs are much more powerful than their hind limbs. By the way, speaking of pterosaur tracks, we actually have a pterodactyloid landing track. And the appropriate way, of course, to spell pterosaur tracks is with a P, but the P is silent. That's a joke. And so what we do is we've got like nothing, and then suddenly there are pterodactyloid feet on the ground, and it starts walking. So I think that's pretty cool. So there's the landing. So Pterodactylus itself, one of the earliest members, relatively primitive, and for a long time people said it was unusual as being a crestless, a pterodactyloid without crests, but it turned out no, it does have a crest, it just was a soft tissue crest. And it turns out pretty much every pterodactyloid has some sort of crest on its head. In some cases, those crests are bony, either on the back of the head or on the front of the snout. But in many cases, it's a soft tissue structure that only preserves where you've got a nice environment to preserve soft tissue. And that's the reason why in things like pterodactylus, people missed it for so long. And just to show some of the variety of bony ones, the extreme is down here with Ichthyosauria. Note, that's the skull, other than the crest. And then there's this huge extension behind it. And what's really weird, not all Ichthyosauria specimens have that. It's been suggested that maybe it's sexual dimorphism. It is additionally been suggested it might have been deciduous. That is, it might have grown and then fallen off like the antlers of deer. So, still under study. And you might go, why would you produce such a gigantic structure if it's just going to fall off? And to which I introduce you to the concept of the moose, which produces a gigantic rack of antlers. And indeed, elk do, and the extinct Irish elk and so forth. Huge, massive structures, which they only produce, they produce every year. So it would be out of characteristic of nature to do that. Now, the last batch of pterosaurs to really show up were the largest as well. You can see here this reconstructed skeleton with a human next to it. Or the reconstruction by Mark Whitten, where it's attacking Tyrannosaurus. Okay, it's attacking hatchling Tyrannosaurus, but it's still attacking Tyrannosaurus nonetheless. These guys, we have their tracks. We know they can move on the ground. Some people even tried to argue that they couldn't fly, although competent biomecanicists show that they probably could, and in fact probably had very long-distance flights. So this is among the very last of the pterosaurs, in fact, the two groups that were successful at the very end of the Mesozoic, at the end of the Cretaceous, were these giant giraffe-sized land forms, or land-walking forms, and things like Pteranodon and its cousins, which were seagoers. They were mostly going out to the sea and fishing. So here's a Tyrannosaur threatening Quetzalcoatlus, one of the best known of these giant forms. In fact, there's one spot on the island of Transylvania. So Transylvania was an island in the late Cretaceous. The largest known predatory animal on Transylvania at the end of the Cretaceous was a pterosaur. So it may have been pterosaurs were the apex predators there. These are dwarf titanosaurs that lived on the same island. And here we can see the size of pterosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous compared to the size of contemporary birds. So these weren't competing with each other. They were having very different lifestyles. On the other hand, it might have been that birds, which were now occupying the small flying body sizes, had outcompeted the smaller pterosaurs. Because there had been plenty of small pterosaurs before that. And it's just, you can't go wrong with showing pictures of Quetzalcoatlus. So pterosaurs seem to have had a variety of diets. We have many of them associated with seafood, but that may reflect the fact that the best preserved ones typically are from lakes and lagoons and marine deposits. That's where they're more likely to wind up articulated. This guy, Dimorphodon, which attacks tourists. Well, in the Jurassic World movie, it attacks tourists. It wouldn't have. It's a lizard eater, eating lizards and small mammals and so forth. It's unlikely to have seen a human as a food item. Ones with sort of classic fish grabs, beaked fish grabbers. We have some with straining teeth. So they were probably going out and getting very small animals like brine shrimp. One extreme form, Pterodactyloid, which was basically a pterosaurian flamingo. So fishing out, straining out small crustaceans and fish. Others, more of a, perhaps a hard food eater, grasping it with a toothless beak and crushing it with teeth behind. And it shows some of the fish grabbers, the filter feeders, and so forth. And in fact, looking at this, there are some groups which probably were flesh eaters in the traditional sense. Not necessarily, we don't have any pterosaurs with beaks like hawks or falcons. They weren't flesh terrors. Terrors, not terrors. But they were probably more like if you've ever seen a stork or a heron, especially a marabou stork. So grabbing something, swallowing it back like that. Unlike the extant groups of archosaurs, crocodilians, and birds, pterosaurs had leathery shells, but as we talked about before, leathery shells may be ancestral for Archosauria. The young, it turns out, were precocial. Their wing proportions of embryos, are they identical proportions to flying babies? But people say this means that they didn't have parental care, and that's wrong-headed. Oh, by the way, there's a baby Pterodactylus and a baby Rhamphorhynchus, and boy, aren't they cute. They probably did have parental care. Their archosaurs, both crocodilians and birds, have extensive parental care. There's evidence that dinosaurs did as well. And just because the babies can move around doesn't mean that they didn't get provisioned by parents or didn't get watched over by parents. After all, chicks, baby chickens get watched over by parents. Baby ostriches get watched over by parents and so forth. So even if these guys can fly around, mommy and or daddy may have been watching over them. In fact, we have sites now of nesting sites. Not just a few isolated eggs, but whole colonies of pterosaurs. So here's lots of these leathery eggs. And the parents there provisioning the young. Pterosaurs had growth something like dinosaurs. They didn't, more like non-avian dinosaurs than extant birds. They did not achieve full body size in the first year. But they did have a full body size, and they got there within a few years. And in a study that came out earlier this year, looking at the biomechanics of babies of multiple branches of Pterosauria. So these are the skeletons of the babies, and here we see them compared to the adults in size. It turns out that their wing mechanics are those of a flyer from hatching. They're not merely gliders from hatching, they are flyers. But given the fact that the babies would have such radical different body sizes than the adults, as soon as they're on their own, they're going to have a lifestyle different than their parents. So much like their terrestrial cousins, the non-avian dinosaurs, they went through ontogenetic niche shifts, that they had different roles in the ecosystem at different stages of their life cycle. Okay, so that gets us through pterosaurs. Now, we're going to start looking at marine reptiles. We'll continue them on Wednesday. So, amniotes, remember terrestrial vertebrates that lay eggs on land or retain them in their body, have gone back to sea many times. And in the modern world, we've got a whole bunch of marine amniotes. We have forms like penguins and seals and sea lions here, which live their life at sea, although they come up on land to reproduce. We have animals which live mostly in the water, although they're adapted still for life on land. These are marine iguanas from the Galapagos. We have fully aquatic animals like sea turtles that only ever come onto land to lay their eggs. And we have animals that spend their entire life in the water. And in fact, the act of coming up on land would be fatal. Things like whales would be examples of that. All of these are amniotes, and yet they had terrestrial ancestors. So we've got a couple types of mammals shown here. We've got a lepidosaur, a turtle, and an archosaur, in the case of the penguin. And they're by far not the only ones. Throughout the history of life, we've seen many amniotes that have gone back to sea. So when you go back into the sea, after all those efforts to become a terrestrial organism that we talked about with the colonization of land, remember that's sort of how I began the second section of the course, was colonization of land, all the transformations you had to make. Why go back to the sea? Well, food resources. That seems to be the predominant initial selective factor. There are plenty of terrestrial animals that are fully terrestrial, but they get food from the water. They go out in the water, they swim, or something to capture food. Humans do, among many other creatures. And from that, we can go creatures that become even more adapted to life in the water, and then even more and even more. So think about a bear. A typical bear gets its food occasionally from a stream. A polar bear is even more adapted. It's a pretty good swimmer. It gets the majority of its food from the water. Something like an otter or a sea otter, even greater fraction of it. And then you get something like a sea lion, which can move around quickly on beaches, but is mostly an aquatic animal, to a seal, which doesn't move on land very well at all, but yet can come up on land, has to reproduce, and then something like a dolphin or other whale, which can't come up on land at all. Once you're in the water, you've got ease of movement. It's a lot easier to move around. Just consider this. Sea turtles migrate. Turtles migrate. You take off that first word, it's an incomprehensible concept. Turtles do not migrate. But sea turtles migrate. They can travel vast distances because it's a lot easier to move that big-ass body around in water than it is for a comparable-sized land turtle to move around. And at least if you're an ectotherm, this last one's important, relatively stable temperatures. Water temperatures do not change as much as air temperatures. So if your body is, if your body's temperature matches the environment, and you're in a stable environment, you can specialize in those behaviors for that particular range of temperatures. That said, as we'll see when we get to the end of marine reptiles, there's good evidence that at least some of them were not strictly ectothermic. That weren't ectothermic, but we'll get to them in a bit. However, going back into the water, you've got to revert most, if not all, or deal with all those problems you had coming back onto land. So, locomotion. You can't walk in the water. Well, there's some groups that stay near shore that are basically walking in the water, but basically you need to learn how to swim in some fashion or other, ultimately resulting in major modifications of your body. You have to deal with breathing. No marine amniote has given up the use of lungs. All the marine amniotes still breathe with lungs. A couple have found accessory ways of getting respiration. It's funny, they breathe through their ass. It turns out that, I have no idea how people started to think to look for this, but there's not that much difference between the rectum and the lung. Okay, there's a hell of a world of difference between them, but both of them start off as outpouchings of the gut, or part of the gut, that's highly vascularized. In the case of the ancestral lung, there were air-gulping fish. The vessels, the capillaries, were able to extract oxygen from the air. It turns out that the butts of sea turtles and some sea snakes can absorb oxygen from the water. But still not that much oxygen, just enough to keep them going. They still need to come up to breathe. Feeding. When you're feeding in the water, you now have to deal with a bunch of new aspects, especially three-dimensionality, and reproduction. Remember I said the amniotic egg could not be laid in the water, and none of these have ever found a solution where you could dump an egg in the water and it hatches. Instead, either you still retain the ability to crawl onto land, lay your eggs there, and then they'll hatch and go out into the world, and get into the water. Many sea snakes do that, sea turtles do that, marine iguanas do that. Or if it's not eggs, in the case of marine mammals, things like seals, sea lions, and so forth, they give birth on land, watch after the babies until the babies are strong enough to live in the water. Or you retain the young in your body. Some sea snakes do that. And, of course, whales and small whales that we call dolphins, they do that. Because they're already mammals and they already have that ability, but they don't even come up on land at all. And we'll see these solutions show up in various marine reptiles. Now, in the Mesozoic, the majority of the marine reptiles seem to form a clade of diapsids. The name of this group is Euryapsida. The relationships between Euryapsids and the other major groups of diapsids is one of great contention. Are they closer to turtles? Are they closer to Lepidopterosaurs? Are they closer to Archosaurs? This remains a matter of debate. So this figure is showing it as an unresolved trichotomy here. But they're not the only marine amniotes. We, of course, have marine turtles, and we had in the Mesozoic. There are actually marine archosaurs. I didn't highlight this. There should have been marine Lepidopterosaurs. You see one right here in the Mesozoic. And one of the first group of marine amniotes actually was before the Mesozoic. It was a group in the Permian. And that's where we'll go to first. Oh, there's the marine Lepidopterosaur. There we go. So this is the first amniote we know of that went back into the sea. So amniotes hauled their ass out of the water and became terrestrial organisms, the Carboniferous. But in the next period, some of them said, screw this, we're going back to the water. This was a dumb idea. So that's these guys. These are the Mesosaurs. The best known from Mesosaurus. There's a couple other genera. And it gives us a model of some of the transformations that we see in marine reptiles. So first of all, they're in the late Permian. They're only about 1 meter long. They're a very primitive group of reptiles, a group called the Pteroreptiles, which are not extant. They didn't make it out of the Triassic. They have needle-like teeth. When we look at the teeth of marine animals, if you have needle-like teeth, those are typically adapted to catching small animals. Probably small, but numerous. So you go after schools of fish or something and catch a few. In the modern world, for instance, gharials, long-snouted, tube-snouted crocodilians have teeth something like this. In contrast, big conical teeth are good for catching large fish or other large vertebrates, or squid or things like that, and rounded teeth are good for crushing shellfish. Mesosaurs had very broad feet, and we don't have them with good skin impressions yet, but probably webbed feet. That seems to be sort of the first way of swimming in the water for most legged animals, is to take your legs and modify them into a very primitive paddle, although this can get modified even further. But the other major organ that animals use for swimming was used by these guys too, and that's the tail. And the tail gets dorsoventrally deep, so stretched from top to bottom, but medial-laterally compressed from side to side, for sculling along, for swimming along. And sort of like modern crocodilians, these guys could do both. They could use their legs to swim around and their tail to swim around. Incidentally, Mesosaurus is from the southern continents, and indeed its distribution was used as one of the evidence that the southern continents were once joined. It was a sea-going animal, but it probably didn't go far from land. It probably stayed within viewing distance of land, much like a marine iguana does today. Now, for a long time, we thought these guys were well adapted for hauling their ass out of the water to lay eggs on land. And they looked like they could have. But it turns out these were able to retain the eggs in the body until they could hatch and live on their own, which is actually a fairly common attribute among sauropsids, among reptiles. Many land lizards, and including many land snakes, do that. They retain the young in the body until they're able to live on their own. Now, they're not feeding it with a placenta the way an advanced mammal does, but they retain the eggs in the body. And that turns out to be advantageous. You don't have to necessarily find a nest on land to hatch your babies. But in the Mesozoic, we see multiple branches of reptiles going back to the sea. So the three here are close relatives. And then these are crocodilians, and these are turtles, and these are a type of seagoing lizard. So let's see. The early Triassic sees, we've got 5 minutes, we've got an explosion of marine amniotes. So there's the Great Extinction Event. The Cretaceous, the Permo-Triassic extinction event, the greatest mass extinction event in history. It takes out the Mesosaurs and many other creatures, but not long after that disaster, we get the recolonization of the water by amniotes and by multiple groups. So the most successful of these groups is a big clade. Not everyone agrees this is a clade, but the people who don't agree it's a clade don't put the different groups together in the same analysis. There tends to be this pattern. You put these groups together in the same analysis, they cluster together. And it's called Euryapsida. So the premier clade of Mesozoic marine reptiles, they are definitely diapsids. However, their relationships with regard to the Lepidopterosaur branch, the lizards and snakes, or to the Archosaur branch, or to the turtles, Testudinata, is not certain. Euryapsids first appeared very early in the Triassic. The last ones die out with the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event. So basically, their range is the entire Mesozoic. The early branches, which are represented by the middle four, are all near-shore animals. They probably didn't get far from the site of land. But two branches, the far ends here, the Ichthyosaurs and the Plesiosaurs, were what we call pelagic, open sea dwellers. That's not to say there weren't Ichthyosaurs that came near shore, and there's even Plesiosaurs that came into freshwater. But some of them also lived out in the open oceans, far, far from land. And they were, not surprisingly, the most adapted forms for deep sea life. Now, these forms I'm just showing for illustrative purposes. You're not going to have to learn too much about any of the primitive forms. Don't worry, you're not going to have to learn the splatogram, and besides, this is just one result of multiple analyses. We've got Ichthyosaurs and their cousins as one group, and everyone else as the other group, including this node here, famous node called Sauropsids. So, just looking at some of the primitive Euryapsids, creatures that were living near shore, they're all Triassic forms, and we found that in many of the primitive Euryapsids, they already have young retained in the body. Now, this was curious, because again, these things have, well, many of them have, arms and legs that look like they could crawl around on land. And so people were comfortable with the thought that they were something like a marine iguana or a sea turtle crawling onto land, excavating a nest in the sand, laying the eggs, and going back into the water. But no, they actually retained the young inside their body. And that's a helpful advantage, because then you can become selected more and more for aquatic life until ultimately you don't have to come out on the land at all. So I'll end by introducing the Ichthyosaurs in a little detail. We'll continue them later on. So Ichthyosaurs, the name means fish lizard. Literally one of the very first groups of Mesozoic reptiles ever discovered. Discovered before the Pterosaurs. Discovered after the Mosasaurs, we'll get to on Wednesday. Discovered before the Plesiosaurs. So the name literally fish lizard. The derived forms are the most highly adapted of the Mesozoic marine reptiles. These are basically the equivalent to whales, if you were comparing them to marine mammals. Show up early in the Triassic, die out in the early part of the late Cretaceous. So they did not make it to the end of the Cretaceous period. Many of them were fish eaters. They also ate squids and squid relatives. We have many of them that have regurgitated up like quantities of the remains of squid relatives. But there's some evidence in some of them of larger food items, including things like turtles or some of the later forms. And we can see here, in a derived ichthyosaur, that the limbs have been transformed into paddles, but for the most part, those paddles are for steering. Notice those aren't particularly big. And in contrast, they have tails radically transformed for swimming. And if it weren't for these wonderful carbonized fossils that gives us the outlines of the body, we wouldn't know that they have a shark-like or dolphin-like dorsal fin or a huge half-moon-shaped tail fin. And these are adaptations for swimming extremely fast, and indeed, very likely, derived ichthyosaurs like this were the fastest Mesozoic swimmers. On a par with big sharks, with dolphins, with tuna. And that's where we'll end for, and this particular one has a long beak. That's where we'll end for now. We'll pick up next time with early ichthyosaurs. We'll talk about the other marine reptiles, and then we'll move on back to land and talk about Mesozoic mammals.